All right, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about some introductions to appraising and establishing market value of properties. Now, one thing I want to make clear before we go into this chapter, because I will talk about appraisal concepts and your chapter and material also talks about appraisal methods. But remember that once you get your real estate license, you are not an appraiser, and only licensed appraisers can give actual appraisals. And again, common everyday language is different than what the law says, so I want to make sure that you're differentiating that an appraiser, a licensed appraiser, gives official appraisals, even though sometimes people say, hey Marlene, I want you to come to my house and appraise it. Tell me what it's worth. Well, we don't do appraisals, but we give estimates of market value. Only licensed appraisers can do an appraisal. But why do we talk about appraisal methods so much in this course? Well, because we use a lot of the same methodology that they do. And think about it. If our approach to valuing property is preliminary, we are trying to establish a value for a property that's going to attract a buyer, but then once we attract that buyer, anytime the buyer is getting a loan, guess what? They're going to have an appraisal, which is sent out by the lender, a definite licensed appraiser to do their own independent valuation of the value of that property. So we use some of the same methods because we want to make sure that down the road we're not going to have problems if an appraiser has to come and verify the value of that property once the price is agreed. So that's a really good introduction to these topics because you're going to hear some differences. You know, there's a funny little cartoon that has, you know, the value of your property as seen by the tax assessor, and it's this big castle. You know, the value of your property based on the insurance company, you know, and it's a small everyday house. The value of your property as seen in the eyes of, you know, you, and it's, you know, your actual property. So value is in the eye of the beholder, and again, it's another one of those fluid concepts. But we're going to talk about market value first. Market value is what we think that a house should be worth on the open market. When we advertise that house for sale, what price that we can offer that property at is most likely going to attract a buyer, and that is market value. Once the buyer comes in and agrees to the price and has a contract, we call that contract price or market price. And then later, whenever the appraiser comes and he verifies that value, then we have legitimate appraised value. Further chapters that you're going to get into even go a little bit further and look at tax value of the property and how those are assessed. But for now, let's look at some of the basic concepts of value in real estate. So first off, there are several foundational principles that guide value in real estate. Things like the principle of anticipation. How much will that house be worth? Principles of progression and regression. Sometimes it's smart to buy the smallest house in the neighborhood because of its association with larger houses. It gains an increment of value by association. I think those concepts are interesting, and you're going to see how those different financial concepts influence the value of property. Then you also have different types of value based on the reason for the valuation of the property. Like I said, for tax purposes, for insurance purposes, for the purchases of a buyer looking at a property. But how do we get to market value? Well, remember before we said there's several different types of properties. Might have lakefront properties. You may have a home in a neighborhood built, like some people say, cookie cutter neighborhoods where all of the houses are fairly similar. So if we have 30 recent sales in a neighborhood where all the houses are 4 bedrooms, 2 baths, 1-story brick with 2-car garages, and they've all sold in the $175,000 range, we can assume that a similar 4-bedroom, 2-bath with a 2-car garage, 1-story all brick is going to sell for around $175,000, right? We call that market comparison. Comparing this property to other houses that have sold on the market should give us an estimate of what a reasonable seller or a reasonable buyer is going to pay for that property. So sometimes we compare to other properties, but what if you have a property that's a unicorn? It's a rare thing. There's not other properties to compare it to. When I'm teaching pre-license in Augusta, we have this gorgeous building down downtown we call the Sacred Heart Cultural Center. It used to be a church years and years, hundreds of years ago. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous church. There's nothing at all like it, and I always make a comment about that building. How would you put a value on that building? We're definitely not going to use comps. There's no other comparable properties, so not everything fits in the same category, which means we have to have different methods of valuing properties. So the most common for real estate is that market comparison approach, or comparative market analysis, where we look at other properties to see the value. But we're also going to learn about a cost approach. If I can't find comps for the Sacred Heart Cultural Center, I might have to figure out what it would cost to rebuild an exact replica of that building, then maybe subtract out some for depreciation because of the age of the structure I'm looking at, and that could be another way of establishing value. So first, let's look at that market value approach in the sales comparison approach. And remembering that agents don't do appraisals, we just give estimates of market value, but the appraisal process steps are similar. So I have a property that I need to put on the market, and I need to establish a value for it. So if I am looking at comparable properties, your information in this section is going to introduce the concept of making adjustments to value of the property to figure out what your subject property is worth. So I'm going to draw an example on the board. Hopefully this will help make sense. I have subject property, my home that we're going to list, right? And let's say this is that 4-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,800 square foot and 2-car garage. Because remember, we're looking at other comparable properties to see how the value of those homes would affect ours. Now remember, we also said that whenever we're dealing with our subject property, the purpose of these evaluations and adjustments of other recent sales, the purpose of that is to establish what the value of this property would be. So whenever you get into adjusting out comps, as your material calls it, remember there's no adjustments ever to be made to the subject property, because in order to adjust the property we have to know what the value is, right? We don't know the value of our subject property, so how can you adjust it? It's kind of a common trick in testing purposes is asking you how you adjust your subject property's price. We don't, because we don't know what the value of it is. But take a look at this. What if there's another house in the area that's maybe 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and 2,100 square foot with a 3-car garage? I want to give you a little acronym to help remember. Whenever we are making adjustments in a property, we do a line-by-line comparison. Now don't get scared, because you don't have to know the value of that 3rd-car garage bay. It's always going to be given to you in question format. So I might have a question that says, comp number 1 has, the 3-car garage, our subject property has a 2-car, and that extra garage bay is worth $15,000. You'll be given the dollar amount, but I want you to remember how to make the adjustments. And there's a little acronym that I like to point out. CIA and CBS. Anytime the comp is better, you're going to subtract that value. If the comp is inferior, you're going to add the value. So let's back up a second. We have the 3-bedroom, 2-bath with the 2,100 square foot. Let's say this house sold already for $150,000, because remember, for adjusting values, we're looking properties that have a value established. So it's a recent sale, buyer and seller agreed on a price, the buyer paid $150,000. Let's also say that we'll go back to the example of that 3-car garage with the extra bay that we said is worth $15,000. So if my 3rd bay is worth $15,000, is our comp better or inferior to the subject property we're looking at? it's better, right? So for that, we're going to comp better, subtract. I like to remember the acronym just because it helps you kind of keep it straight, the natural tendency. Why would I subtract from the value if it's better? Because I want you to look at it this way. When you're making adjustments, I have to subtract this value from our recent sale because it's better, because that brings it down to the same level as the subject property that we're trying to establish a value for. The opposite with comp inferior, add. If I have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, and all the other things, all the other characteristics are the same, the comp is inferior, I'm going to add whatever my dollar amount is for the adjustments to bring it up to the same level as my subject property. So have some fun whenever you get to that section, because I think it's a little bit real-world real estate, making those adjustments and learning how value is actually established in properties. Not only are you going to learn the market comparison approach, you're also going to learn that there are income producing properties. We deal with lots of investors, and sometimes we do also have to figure out what an investor would pay for the house, and for their purposes, they're not usually concerned with just the overall value based on what other buyers would pay. They're usually concerned with how much money they're going to make on that property. So they look at what we call a capitalization or a cap rate. What type of return on investment am I going to get if I put my money into this property? So the more I pay for the property with my income producing properties, the more I pay, the less my rate of return is going to be on that property. And again, you're going to take a deeper dive, but make sure that you're paying attention to the interplay of how much you pay and what your capitalization rate is, because it's a concept that, rest assured, you'll see again. The concept of income producing property and establishing value. This session, of course, is going to close up with some of the regulation that's over the top of the standardized procedures for pricing and evaluations, and some of the rules regarding that end of the industry. And I hope you enjoy this section as you actually start to manipulate some values of properties like you will in everyday real estate to determine what a property would be worth to future potential buyers. We'll see you soon.